Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here and welcome to my latest video. This time based on an article that I did on the Imperium News Network, so if you'd like to read it instead of listening to it, you absolutely can. Just go to imperium.news and click on the article there. So, during the past 3 years we've seen 3 consecutive different new player experience models. We entered 2016 with the traditional basis of tutorial agents, which had been the core of EVE's NPE for over 5 years at that point. But by the last half of it we'd seen the introduction of Team Genesis's Inception NPE concept, which was relatively well received by the community. This new grand vision of a story-driven NPE didn't end up lasting long, however, and in 2018 it was almost entirely scrapped and replaced with an agency-driven NPE. And whilst we sit halfway through 2019, the topic of the NPE is one that's still paraded around as a major problem by the player base, and most notably by Hilmar himself. Now, CCP's thread of thinking on this is something that we can start to pick up on as early as 2012, when the executive producer of EVE at the time, John Lander, spoke to Eurogamer about the intention to try and make game systems more accessible to new players, with a focus on the Crime Watch changes that were being introduced at the time. But no numbers were talked about until 2014, when we were given this rather basic chart during FanFest. It's important to note that this was pre-Ascension, so there was a much bigger barrier to entry for players starting in the first place, as it generally required an initial payment to do so outside of trial accounts. We don't have numbers either for how many people were trying EVE Online during this opinion, as opposed to later on either, nor at what point retention was considered to have been achieved in this chart, especially given that the 2-hour bar was something that was talked about heavily in the years to come. Still, this 50% retention rate was seen as a problem, especially as the wheels began to turn inside CCP to direct the game towards an expansion into the free-to-play model. Over the course of 2016, player retention went from something for CCP to worry about to the kind of thing talked about on this very website, truly entering the public conversation in a big way, as CCP started talking about it more publicly. As I mentioned in the introduction, this came right in front of the first major revamp that EVE has had to its NPE for a long time, bringing it up to the level of what I've seen in most other MMOs in terms of a story and set piece driven tutorial that eventually just dumped you off in the game world. There was even a second patch to the feature a few months later that incorporated feedbacks from new player groups on exactly what quote-unquote life skills their newbies were missing. Now, it's impossible to tell what CCP was aiming for with this NPE redesign in terms of concrete goals, but it's clear over this period that retention, by whatever metric CCP was using to measure it, was falling. Quote, "We were super nervous, both internally and externally in terms of our player base, when it came to going free to play. Last year, we were sitting at roughly a 50% retention rate, and now we're much lower than that. But partially because we have so many more people coming in and trying the game. That's always a good problem to have." Unquote. CCP rise to Destructoid in 2017. So, in 2018, after a year of changes, the Inception NPE was scrapped. All the voice acting and dramatic storylines were replaced with CCP's new streamlined PVE toy, the Agency, which was now expected to bear the brunt of any new player's questions as to how to play the game. What this means, realistically, is that during the last half of 2017, CCP decided to simply start from scratch and develop an entirely new NPE, rather than iterating on what they had. And what did CCP, and by extension the player base, have to show for it? Retention rates that were, by Hilmar's admission, worse than they were before this new NPE redesign. This low retention rate being presented so clearly to the public serves to both emphasize CCP's internal focus and to justify to the community why the NPE needs to be reworked, despite the fact that the company has just spent 3 years doing exactly that. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that a team is already, as I read this, working on bringing some new angle on how to coach new players through the first few hours of EVE to life. Now, I'm not going to be the person to sit here and say that CCP should just abandon the new players in the forest so that we can make sure that we get only the strongest Spartan babies who can Google their way out of any problem. Everyone loves newer players, myself included, but I think CCP needs to realise that the new player experience isn't the problem here, the player experience is. And constantly having a full developer team working to remake your NPE means that you simply don't have the dev hours to significantly impact that, especially given how painfully few feature development teams currently operate inside the company. This isn't CCP cutting apart the golden goose to find out how it laid the egg, it's CCP buying gooses and constantly being disappointed that the gooses they buy don't produce golden eggs, and then buying another goose. So what I want to do here is just to highlight a few areas of the game that CCP could be putting the weight of a full developer team behind, that because, as Rise talked about in his original 2014 presentation on the NPE, quote, "A good NPE comes from good foundational systems. There are currently problems that affect all players, but new players more than anyone else." End quote. CCP Rise 2014 FanFest. The new player experience vision. This is even something CCP seems to recognise as being a necessary part of the drive towards improving the NPE, with changes like bringing PVE damage profiles into the game, so I hope this will serve as food for thought on that end. But my main thrust is that changes like these shouldn't be afterthoughts to revamping the tutorial, as it's my opinion that the more intuitive your gameplay systems are in the first place, the less you need to explain in the tutorial that you're designing. First on my list of systems to talk about is the skill system. Skill training in EVE is simultaneously one of the game's greatest assets and one of its greatest flaws. On one hand, it's the least restrictive system imaginable, where you can train whatever you want with no grinding, but that opens up its own flaws, with players feeling like they're time-gated, and whether or not catching up is even possible being by far the most common question asked of me about EVE. Combined with the arcane methodology by which skill training speed is calculated, and the information overload given to you by showing every skill in the game right away, and it being something that you want to start doing and actively figuring out during your first session of play, means that it just becomes this monolithic hurdle for newer players to jump over in terms of trying to understand the complexities of the game. Seriously, go and open the character sheet and just pretend that you know nothing about EVE. Where do I click to see the basic skills or have something suggested to me? How do I find out what training a skill even does? How do I know what's important for me to spend my unallocated SP on? How do I add more skills to be trained? None of this is addressed in the current NPE at all. Now, I've pitched several band-aid solutions to skill training over the years that I've spent on the CSM, from simply having players load into the game with a quote-unquote basic skill plan plugged in order to delay introducing the mechanic until a lot later in people's playtime, to having a more basic menu layout that's easier to navigate and which can be opted out of once you want to start looking at the more advanced parts of the skill tree. But I think that those band-aids would just be that, band-aids to cover the fundamentally archaic back end of the skill training system. It wouldn't help new players understand the mechanics, it would just delay the point at which new players have to actually worry about understanding the mechanics that are going on and being handled for them, which isn't a really healthy mindset to have in game design, at least from my opinion. Think about what could be done with a 3 to 6 month long dev cycle focused purely on bringing the skill system, not just the UI around it, but the core gameplay conceit of how it's structured and works, into 2019. Would it be as marketable as a completely new NPE? Probably not. But think about all the problems that all players face that you could then solve with a new system. Things like remaps and attributes requiring optimization. You know, how many times have you locked an ult into a crappy remap and regretted it for a whole year? And consider just how many newbies fall into that same trap and then just end up stuck and quitting the game because they feel like they've got artificially slower progression because they made a mistake early on. Or how about fixing how unclear the paths are for progression for players? Imagine have something like the share overview or share fit system, but for skill plans, so you could easily help someone see what you think that they should train without forcing them to go outside of the client. You could even take a stab at addressing the poor sense of scaling. Something like small blaster specialization 5 isn't going to be the difference between you winning and losing in 99.9% of cases in a fight, but a new player often doesn't see beyond "I'm worse than I possibly could be." With some good redesign choices, I feel like it would be easier for CCP to encourage spreading out into a wider range of skills, rather than feeding the mindset of specializing in one particular thing, which I think is unhealthy for players to get into. Something like making the 5th level of a skill be worth less than 1 to 4, for example, might help a lot there. Hell, I'm even in favor of adding more player agency. And that's going to be a little controversial, but I'm all for giving new players more playtime based ways to catch up. There's nothing that I've found that's more successful in keeping players around and interested in the game than by dangling an SP carrot at the end of a string. And CCP knows this, it's why you can see the jumps in active accounts on the MER every time they do an SP login event. And that makes me ask, why aren't they using SP or levels in the Magic 14 skills as milestones for newer players after they move beyond the first few hours of the game to try and get them to explore, different career options? And speaking of career options, that brings us on to the second thing that I think that CCP could focus on, which is the dearth of low skill point PvE. Like it or not, the majority of players who join EVE aren't really looking for the same PvP everywhere game that I assume most of the people listening to this are involved in, and especially not during their first time playing with the game. Because of that, new players generally get shunted right into the mission system to chip away at the level 1 to level 2 reputation grind. And if you know what you're doing, you can eliminate this entirely by just training connections to level 3, but new players are unlikely to figure that out for themselves given the just discussed nature of the skill system. So, new players who just want to PvE are simply thrown into a mission system that hasn't been updated in multiple years, with no indication other than through the agency of how they might progress to other activities, or that other activities even exist. Even then, the activities that are on offer for a player in their first month or so of playing are still just variations on the missioning system, until things start to branch out with Abyssals and the Epic arcs. I think that there needs to be a great deal of introspection on whether or not the PvE gameplay of missions should be the main piece of content that new players are steered towards, and whether or not it serves as the most effective face of the game for weeks, if not months, to people that CCP is enticing to try and stay active with the product. Now if it is, great, but it needs to be brought up to the modern standards of how engaging PvE can be in EVE. And if it isn't, then there's a huge gap in terms of using the NPE to prepare and guide people towards good short-term goals, and in the provision of good content to those potential long-term PvE players in the first place. Now I don't have a slick segue for this, but the final player experience issue is one that I don't think too many people really value enough, and that's the difficulty of finding a player corp to associate with. And that's something that will help new players with answers to many questions that CCP simply can't cover in their own tutorials. Questions like, what's the best way to fit X ship? Not only that, but being part of a larger group and working together to do things has always been a huge part of EVE's marketing, with pieces like This Is EVE and the Invasion trailers emphasizing group play aspects of the game. We even know that people who join player corporations are more likely to stay in the game, although I suspect that could just be that players who are willing to put forth the effort to join a corporation were predisposed to wanting to continue to play anyway. Given all that, it's bizarre to me just how little information the client gives you when trying to pick what corporation to join. No retention rates, no average pilots online, no looking at their kill history, just a long list of everyone who matches your search filters, a member count, and a text box for the corporation to tell you why you should personally pick them, which can be full of lies for all anyone cares. Now, there's an argument that any comprehensive rating system like this would be gamed, and I don't doubt that for a second. We're all EVE players after all. but I feel like we're woefully under-equipping people to start to search for the corporations that meet up with what they want out of the game, and I don't feel like continuing to just direct people to one of the 4 to 6 big nullsec newbie corporations is a sustainable future for the game, despite the great job those corporations do, just because we're not seeing new communities rise up naturally and grow into their own forces. And not every player is going to want to go to nullsec right away either. Some people are always going to want to prefer smaller groups to integrate with. There's a ton of reasons why those big groups might not be perfect for someone, and if that's the case, how do you find them a place to fit into the community? This is a big problem, and I doubt it would be easy to craft a solution that hits the right mix between informing without overwhelming, especially with the overhead of trying not to provide an accidental form of intel. But if retention is CCP's main goal, I can think of no better place to look for improvement than here. So, is it all bad? No. Like I said right up at the top here, CCP does seem to be aware that they need to modernize some of their systems, as can be seen in the push to make the fitting process have a few more handholds for new players. If that hadn't been on the cards, I can guarantee that fitting would have made its way into this article as a problem, given how little of it is properly explained. Concepts like fitting resources, so CPU and power grid, aren't even explicitly introduced anywhere within the game except the fitting UI. But with features like community fittings, maybe that's not necessary. My concern is simply that CCP has continually tunneled in on seeing the NPE, and therefore the only important driver of retention in newer players, as just that little tutorial that CCP creates, that particular guided experience. Whilst this undoubtedly is an important part of driving player retention by getting them to want to stick around for the first few hours, there's always going to be a sharp drop-off at that stage, and that's not an EVE-specific problem. 70% of trial players quit WoW, an undeniably more accessible game, before reaching level 10, which is, around 2 to 3 hours into it, from what I understand. If CCP can see the forest for what it is, and work to keep the players who are still interested after the tutorial inside the game at that point, then I think that we could one day see EVE regain the heights that it used to have in terms of player base. But ripping out the current tutorial or replacing it with a new one, seemingly just fishing for a smash hit that will solve all the retention issues with the game, just smacks of the Jesus feature mentality that nearly brought CCP to its knees in 2011. So, please, if you're watching this, Hilmar, stop reworking the NPE. Anyway, thank you for listening to my rant. As always, you can take a look at our Discord if you would like to contribute to the conversation or give me feedback. And a special thanks goes out to our Crassus Pinche Infidel from Old School, as well as to our $5 patrons in Dustin Prater, Meeks, and Czar. And to everyone else who contributes to the Patreon, which keeps the show running, which you can also check out in the description below. Have a wonderful day, and as always, fly smart.